The Caucasus Mountains, Soviet Armenia. A September night, 1957. The moon glints on the snow-capped peaks. The silence is absolute, broken only by the whisper of a high-altitude wind. In a remote, darkened valley, a single figure stands in a clearing. He is not a shepherd. He wears a thick, padded suit. A peculiar harness of leather and steel is strapped to his torso. His eyes are fixed not on the ground but on the sky. With a hiss of compressed gas, he releases a small weather balloon. It climbs, a black orb against the stars. Unspooling behind it is a thin, almost invisible nylon line. It rises hundreds of feet. Then 1,000. The line goes taut. The man checks his harness one final time. His heartbeat is the loudest sound in the valley. To the west, a low drone disturbs the mountain silence. A shape emerges from the shadows of the peaks. A U.S. Air Force C-119 flying boxcar flying dangerously low, its engine straining. On its nose, a V-shaped steel yoke glints in the moonlight. The pilot spots the balloon, a faint speck against the void. He nudges the control yoke, lining up the aircraft's nose with a thin line hanging from the heavens. The mission is audacious, insane, and the only way to get the man out. Soviet radar screens miles away show nothing. The low-flying aircraft is a ghost. The balloon is invisible. The operation does not officially exist. The C-119 descends. The yoke strikes the line. It was a moment of perfect, silent engineering, poised to vanish a man from the heart of the Soviet Empire, leaving its vast air defense network seeing nothing but empty sky. This was the Fulton Surface-to-Air Recovery System, the Skyhook. The Iron Curtain did not merely divide a continent. It sealed an entire world. By the mid-1950s, the Cold War had solidified into a tense, global stalemate defined by borders of ideology, barbed wire, and radar coverage. The United States and its allies faced an intelligence black hole. Satellites were in their infancy, unreliable and blind to human secrets. Electronic intercepts could gather fragments, but they could not penetrate the closed-door meetings of the Politburo, or steal the technical manuals for a new Soviet missile. Human intelligence, the spy on the ground, was the only answer. But getting an agent into the Soviet Union was a monumental risk. Getting them out alive with their hard-won information was considered nearly impossible. The borders were militarily impregnable. The coastlines watched. Airspace was a layered kill zone of radar-directed anti-aircraft artillery, MiG interceptors and surface-to-air missiles that were growing more sophisticated by the month. Early methods were crude and deadly. Parachute drops for agents were fraught. The slow descent made them vulnerable to detection, and the aircraft delivering them had to penetrate hostile airspace. Exfiltration over land through checkpoints was a gamble with deceit, often ending in a Lubyanka basement. Submarine pickups along remote coasts were slow, exposed, and limited to naval intelligence targets. The CIA and its partners in Britain's MI6 faced a stark equation. The value of a high-level asset behind the curtain was incalculable, but the cost of retrieving them was deemed unpayable with existing technology. This operational deadlock was broken not in a Langley conference room, but by an inventor who saw a connection between a comic strip and a wartime necessity. Robert Edison Fulton Jr., scion of the famous steamboat family and an aeronautical engineer of prolific imagination, was inspired by a 1930s Popeye cartoon where the sailor was snatched from the ground by an airplane using a hook and line. During World War II, he had witnessed the Allied use of similar rudimentary methods to pick up downed pilots and agents using slow-flying aircraft that snagged weighted lines with a grapnel hook. The process was dangerous, limited to open water or very flat terrain, and highly unreliable. Fulton envisioned something far more systematic, daring, and technical. His concept was deceptively simple. An individual on the ground would deploy a large balloon, lifting a sturdy nylon line hundreds of feet into the air. A specially modified aircraft would then fly into that line, capture it on a V-shaped yoke on its nose, and winch the person off the ground and into the sky. The genius was in the details, the engineering that could translate a cartoon idea into a tool for clandestine war. He called it the Skyhook. The U.S. Navy, intrigued by its potential for retrieving astronauts after splashdown or plucking sailors from the sea, funded initial development. But it was the CIA's Special Activities Division that saw its true, darker potential. Here was a system that could pluck a human asset from virtually any terrain, forest, mountain, city outskirts, without the aircraft ever needing to land or even slow to a stall. It could, in theory, operate below effective radar coverage. It was a vertical escape hatch from enemy territory. The agency acquired the system, cloaked it in maximum secrecy under the codename Project Beezy Roar, and began a series of brutal, clandestine tests. They used anthropomorphic dummies, then pigs, animals with a physiology roughly similar to humans in terms of weight and centripetal force. The results were violent but promising. The snatch was a terrifying, instantaneous event that subjected the package to forces up to 15 gs, a brutal jolt followed by a dizzying ascent dangling 150 feet below the aircraft before being winched on board. By 1957, the system was declared operationally ready. The world was at a fever pitch. The Soviets had launched Sputnik, shattering American technological confidence. The space race had begun, but the espionage war beneath it was entering a new, almost science fiction chapter. The stage was set for a silent, desperate gamble. The first live test would not be with a dummy or a pig. It would be with one of the CIA's most valuable and vulnerable human assets, a man already deep inside the lion's den. That asset was Colonel Pyotr Semyonovich Popov of the GRU, Soviet military intelligence. Popov was not an ideologue turned by Western charm. He was a disaffected officer, motivated by a simmering resentment of the Soviet system and a desire for personal financial gain. While stationed in East Berlin in 1953, he had slipped a note to an American diplomat, beginning one of the most fruitful espionage relationships of the early Cold War. 4 years he provided a torrent of priceless information, the complete order of battle for Soviet forces in Europe, details of new tank and aircraft designs, and crucially, the identities of hundreds of GRU officers under diplomatic cover, shattering Soviet intelligence networks across the West. But by 1957, Popov's position was crumbling. He had been recalled to Moscow, a move that often preceded exposure. He was under sporadic surveillance, his movements restricted. The CIA knew he was a walking dead man. The information he still carried in his mind, and any potential future access, was too valuable to abandon. A traditional exfiltration was impossible. The Berlin tunnels were compromised. The borders were sealed. Popov was trapped in the heart of the USSR. He became the designated package for the Skyhook's first live operational test. The plan, codenamed Operation Viking Hammer, was a breathtaking synthesis of audacity and meticulous planning. Popov was given a pretext for travel to a remote location, the Caucasus region, ostensibly for military exercises. His CIA handlers selected a precise extraction point, a secluded valley in Soviet Armenia, far from major population centers and, critically, on the periphery of dense Soviet air defense coverage. The geography was a weapon. The mountainous terrain provided radar shadows, places where low-flying aircraft could hide from ground-based surveillance. The timing was calculated for minimal lunar illumination and predictable patrol schedules of Soviet border guards and air interceptor units. Every variable was weighed: wind speed for the balloon, the power setting for the C-119's engines during the snatch, the physiological limits of a middle-aged man about to be subjected to forces usually reserved for fighter pilots. On the other side of the equation was the Soviet Air Defense Forces, the PVO Strany. This was a vast, integrated system built on the trauma of the German surprise attack in 1941. It was designed to be impregnable. A layered network of early warning radars like the Token and Knife Rest lined the borders, feeding data to command centers. Interceptor regiments flying MiG-17s and the new supersonic MiG-19s stood on quick reaction alert. Further inland, belts of SA-1 Guild and the newer, more mobile SA-2 Guideline surface-to-air missiles protected key political and industrial sites. The system was built to detect and destroy high-altitude bombers and reconnaissance aircraft. Its doctrine, its technology, and its entire mindset were oriented outward and upward, towards threats in the stratosphere. The psychological dimension was equally critical. The Soviet military was rigorously trained, but it operated within a framework of rigid doctrine and expected enemy behavior. They anticipated spy planes like the U-2 flying at extreme altitudes. They anticipated border incursions by fast jets. They did not anticipate a lone man in a field, a weather balloon, and a low-flying cargo plane performing a maneuver that defied conventional aviation logic. The Skyhook's greatest defense was its sheer improbability. As Colonel Popov stood in that Armenian valley on the appointed night, he represented the culmination of years of technological desperation and intelligence warfare. He was the point where Fulton's inventive genius met the CIA's operational grit, aimed directly at the blind spot of one of the world's most formidable military architectures. The balloon ascended. The line went taut. The hum of the approaching C-119 was the sound of the impossible being attempted, a direct challenge to the sovereignty of Soviet airspace and the competence of its defenders, played out not with missiles, but with nylon rope and cold nerve. For the agent on the ground, codenamed the package, the Skyhook was not a system. It was a profound, solitary trial, a violent collision of absolute trust and utter helplessness. The psychological preparation began weeks, sometimes months, in advance. The agent, already living a life of paralyzing duality, had to internalize a new, bizarre set of rituals. He was trained on the balloon apparatus, the helium or hydrogen canisters, the inflation hose, the spool for the 500-foot, 1/8-inch thick braided nylon line. He practiced connecting the lift line to his harness, a modified Navy parachute harness with a heavy-duty metal ring at the chest. The harness itself was a psychological weight, a constant reminder of the brutal physics to come. He was drilled on weather assessment. Wind over 8 knots could bow the line, making capture impossible. He learned to listen for the specific pitch of the C-119's twin radial engines, distinguishing it from the sound of a Soviet transport or worse, a hovering mill helicopter. On the night of the operation, the isolation was total. No handler was present. No security team watched the perimeter. He was alone with his equipment, his fear, and the vast, silent hostility of the territory around him. Every rustle in the undergrowth was the KGB. Every distant light was a patrol jeep. The act of inflating the balloon was an excruciatingly vulnerable process, taking several minutes where he was stationary, illuminated by moonlight, tethered to a growing, unmistakable marker. Then came the wait. Balloon aloft, line taut, he was now a fixed point in space, a human buoy. He could only watch the sky. The minutes stretched. Doubt was the true enemy. Had the aircraft been detected? Shot down? Had the timing failed? He was now a perfect target, connected to the heavens by a thread. The commitment was absolute. Once the balloon was released, his presence was compromised. There was no way to covertly pack up and slip away. The snatch itself was a moment of controlled catastrophe. First, the roar of the low-flying aircraft, a sudden terrifying presence. Then the impact. The line would be caught by the nose yoke at approximately 125 knots. The agent would be yanked off his feet with a force that could exceed 15 times gravity. He described it as being hit by a truck, a train, a divine fist. The world became a blur of acceleration, disorientation, and extreme physical stress. He would spin violently, shooting upward at a rate of 150 feet per second, the ground dropping away with sickening speed. The harness dug into flesh, compressing the spine, straining the neck. Agents reported temporary blackouts, tunnel vision, and a sensation of their internal organs being rearranged. Then the ascent. Dangling from the 150-foot recovery line, buffeted by the aircraft's prop wash and slipstream, he would be winched up over a period of several agonizing minutes. The winch operator in the aircraft's open rear door was his only link to salvation, fighting wind and cold to reel in a living, fragile cargo. Finally, strong hands would grab him, drag him into the fuselage and collapse the harness. He was safe. He was out. But the physical toll, bruises, abrasions, cracked ribs, psychological shock, was the price of this miraculous escape. The human body was the system's most critical and most fragile component. The Fulton Skyhook was a masterpiece of pragmatic, brutal engineering. Every component was designed to solve a specific, narrow problem in the chain of a seemingly impossible action. It began with the balloon. Not a simple weather balloon, but a durable, neoprene-coated fabric envelope, typically 10 feet in diameter when inflated. It was filled with helium for safety, though early tests used more volatile hydrogen for greater lift. Its job was not to lift the man, but to elevate the line to a precise altitude, between 400 and 500 feet, placing it directly in the capture path of the aircraft's nose yoke. The balloon was fitted with a bright strobe light for the pilot to see, but one filtered to be nearly invisible from the ground or from a distance, a faint wink in the darkness only visible from a specific approach angle. The line was a marvel of materials science. It was a braided nylon cord, 1/8 inch thick, with a breaking strength of 2,000 pounds. Nylon was chosen for its elasticity. It needed to absorb the tremendous shock of the snatch without snapping, stretching like a rubber band to mitigate the G-forces on the human body. One end was attached to the balloon, the other to the agent's harness via a complex release mechanism. The aircraft modification was the most visible engineering feat. The chosen workhorse was initially the C-119 Flying Boxcar, and later the C-130 Hercules. A 30-foot V-shaped Skyhook yoke was mounted on the aircraft's nose, made of hollow steel tubing. At the apex of the V were two spring-loaded, padded chop arms. As the aircraft flew into the line would slide down the V to the apex. The impact would trigger the chop arms, which snapped shut, capturing the line and automatically severing the connection to the now-free balloon. This immediate cut was critical. A balloon trailing into the engines would be catastrophic. Inside the aircraft, the recovery system took over. The captured line was fed through a hatch above the cockpit and into the cabin, where it was secured to a powerful hydraulic winch. The winch operator, wearing a safety harness, would then begin the arduous task of reeling in the 150-foot line with the agent on the end, fighting the aerodynamic drag and oscillation. The entire cabin was cleared, padded, and turned into a medical bay for the moment the agent, dazed, injured, and freezing, was pulled inside. Every piece, from the gas valve on the helium bottle to the shear pin in the chop arms, had to work perfectly under conditions of extreme stress, darkness, and operational pressure. The Skyhook was not elegant. It was a sequence of violent mechanical actions: inflate, ascend, capture, snatch, sever, winch. Its beauty lay in its brutal functionality, a Rube Goldberg machine built for saving lives in the most hostile environments on Earth. Executing a Skyhook recovery was not a mere matter of flying to coordinates. It was a precision low-level penetration mission, a high-stakes game of hide-and-seek against one of the world's most dense and paranoid air defense networks. The mission profile was a study in audacious vulnerability. The aircraft, a large, slow-flying cargo plane, had to penetrate Soviet or satellite-state airspace, fly hundreds of miles at low level, locate a single point of light in a vast, dark landscape, perform a delicate maneuver, and then egress, all while remaining undetected. The planning was astronomically complex. Routes were painstakingly charted to exploit terrain masking. Flight planners pored over topographic maps and radar propagation studies, seeking valleys, canyons, and river courses that would keep the aircraft in the radar shadow of natural features. They timed the mission around known patrol schedules of Soviet interceptors and the orbits of early warning radar planes. The crew, often drawn from the U.S. Air Force's Special Operations Units under the CIA's direction, were among the best in the world. The pilot needed the skills of a fighter jock and the nerves of a test pilot. The approach had to be perfect: too high and they would miss the line or be acquired by radar, too low and they would hit the ground. They practiced the snatch for hours on remote ranges in the United States, using weighted lines, honing a visual approach that relied on the faint strobe on the balloon. Navigators worked with stellar and terrain-following systems, as GPS was decades away. The radio was silent. The entire mission was conducted under strict emissions control. A single errant radar pulse or radio transmission could be fatal. The greatest tactical shield was the Soviet mindset. Pivyostrany doctrine was designed to defend against strategic attack, formations of high-altitude bombers and supersonic reconnaissance aircraft. Their radar screens were calibrated to filter out clutter, ground returns, weather, and low-flying slow movers like helicopters or small civilian aircraft. A lone C-119 flying at 200 feet above the terrain would likely appear as negligible ground clutter, if it appeared at all. The system's human operators, watching for the distinct, powerful blips of incoming threats, were psychologically conditioned to dismiss the faint, fleeting ghost of a Skyhook aircraft. It was an act of tactical camouflage performed not with stealth technology, but by exploiting the enemy's own perceptual biases. The Skyhook existed in a void of official acknowledgement. From its inception, it was cloaked in a labyrinth of compartmentalization, code names, and deliberate obscurity. This secrecy was not merely procedural, it was the system's primary defense and its political necessity. Officially, Project BZ-ROAR did not exist. Development and testing were buried within the U.S. Navy's Office of Naval Research, with the cover story of developing a system for retrieving space capsules or downed pilots. This provided plausible deniability and a legitimate budget stream. Within the CIA, knowledge was restricted to a handful of officers in the Special Activities Division and the Directorate of Science and Technology. Pilots and crew were sheep-dipped, temporarily resigned from military service and contracted to the agency, creating a legal firewall. The equipment itself was sterile. Balloons, harnesses, and line spools bore no markings. They were stored in covert depots in Western Europe and aboard specially configured submarines and surface vessels for maritime operations. Training took place at isolated facilities like Harvey Point, North Carolina, or on remote islands in the Pacific, away from prying eyes. The need for this secrecy was underscored by catastrophic failure. In the early 1960s, a Skyhook mission codenamed Operation Cold Feet aimed to retrieve a Soviet acoustic beacon from an ice floe in the Arctic. The equipment was successfully snatched, but the line fouled. The crew was forced to cut it, leaving the classified package dangling over Soviet territory. The incident, though kept secret, was a chilling reminder. A compromised Skyhook mission could deliver not only a dead agent, but intact, incriminating American technology directly into Soviet hands. Every component, every procedure was designed to leave no trace, to be deniable at the highest levels of government. In the event of a crash or capture, the official line would be unwavering: the United States knew nothing. The aircraft was off course. The equipment was not of American origin. The Skyhook lived and died in the shadows, a testament to the Cold War's fundamental truth. Some victories could only be counted in silence, and some tools were too dangerous to ever see the light of day. The night of September 28, 1957, was crystal clear over the Caucasus. In the designated valley, Colonel Pyotr Popov completed his final act as a GRU officer. He opened the valve on the helium canister. The hiss was deafening in the silence. The black balloon, its strobe light set to the predetermined frequency, began to fill, a slow-growing orb against the starfield. He felt the harness straps bite into his shoulders and thighs. The line spool at his feet began to spin as the balloon lifted it, snaking upward into the cold, thin air. 500 feet above him, the line went taut. He was now anchored to the sky. He scanned the western horizon, ears straining against the mountain wind. Every second stretched into an eternity of exposure. In his mind, he ran through the contingencies. If the aircraft did not arrive within the 30-minute window, he was to disconnect, bury the gear, and attempt his escape and evasion plan. A plan both knew had a near-zero chance of success. He was a man standing on a trapdoor, waiting for the rope to either pull him up or be cut beneath him. 70 miles to the southwest, at a covert forward operating location in Turkey, the engines of a specially modified C-119 flying boxcar coughed to life. The aircraft, painted in a non-standard, dark matte finish, bore no markings. Its crew of 4 all-civilian contract pilots and specialists went through their final checks. The navigator confirmed the ingress route, a path that wove through mountain passes, staying below ridge lines, a course plotted not for efficiency but for invisibility. The pilot, a veteran of the Korean War airlift, focused on the critical airspeeds. 125 knots for the snatch, not a knot more or less. The winch operator in the rear tested the hydraulic system one final time. The aircraft rolled onto the runway and lifted into the dark without tower clearance, its lights extinguished. The penetration of Soviet airspace was a tense, silent ballet with the terrain. The C-119 dropped to an altitude of 200 feet, the mountains rising around it like black walls. The navigator called out distances to waypoints, his voice calm in the intercom. The pilot's hands were steady on the yoke, making minute adjustments to follow the contour of the land. In the cockpit, they watched for the sudden glow of a radar warning receiver. It never lit. Their greatest enemy was the land itself. A sudden peak and unseen power line, a miscalculation of altitude in the darkness would end the mission in a fireball. They were flying on instinct, training, and a detailed map. After 45 minutes of nerve-shredding low-level flight, the navigator announced they were in the target area. The pilot began a gentle climb to 500 feet, the optimal altitude to spot the balloon's strobe and position for the snatch. All eyes scanned the blackness ahead. Then the co-pilot saw it, a single, faint, rhythmic blink against the backdrop of mountains, almost indistinguishable from a star. Contact. 11 o'clock low. Was the balloon. The pilot banked gently, lining up the nose yoke with the barely visible thread of the line below it. The approach was critical. Too steep and they would overshoot or strike the ground. Too shallow and they would miss the line entirely. The aircraft slowed to 125 knots. The yoke, a stark silhouette against the windscreen, was aimed directly at the point where the line met the balloon. In the rear, the winch operator braced, his hand on the release for the balloon's tether line inside the cabin. On the ground, Popov heard the growing thunder of engines. He saw the dark shape blot out stars as it descended toward him. This was the point of no return. He locked his arms across his chest, grabbed his harness straps and bent his knees slightly, the only posture he could adopt to survive what came next. The C-119 filled his world. The noise was overwhelming. Then impact. The snatch was not a smooth engagement. It was a catastrophic, violent theft of a human being from the earth. The steel yoke on the C-119's nose struck the nylon line at precisely 125 knots. The spring-loaded chop arms at the V's apex snapped shut with a metallic clang audible even over the engine roar, instantly severing the line to the balloon. The released balloon, now just a piece of rogue debris, shot away into the night sky, a decoy for any puzzled observer. For Colonel Popov, the universe exploded into a blur of overwhelming force. One moment he was braced on the ground, the next he was a projectile. The 15 gs of force slammed through his body like a freight train. He was yanked skyward at a velocity that ripped the breath from his lungs. His vision tunneled to a pinprick, then went black as blood was driven from his brain. He did not feel the harness straps cutting into his flesh. He did not hear the scream that was torn from his throat by the acceleration. He was unconscious before he had risen 50 feet. In the cockpit, the pilot felt a distinct, heavy thump through the airframe, followed by a sharp lurch. He immediately pushed the throttles forward, gaining airspeed and altitude, turning onto the pre-planned egress route. The snatch was successful. Now they had to get out. The winch operator in the rear cabin saw the nylon line go taut through the roof hatch. He engaged the powerful hydraulic winch. The line began to spool in, but the load on the end was dead weight. An unconscious, 180-pound man, spinning like a pendulum in the 150-knot slipstream. The ascent took 4 minutes. 4 minutes where Popov dangled as a vulnerable, swinging counterweight below the fleeing aircraft. Had Soviet radar somehow detected them now, he would have been a sitting duck. Had the line snagged or frayed, he would have fallen to his death. Inside, the winch operator fought to steady the line, watching as it slowly shortened. Finally, a shape emerged from the darkness outside the open rear door. A man, limp, still spinning slightly. The operator and the jump master lunged, grabbing harness straps, arms, anything they could. With a final heave, they hauled the dead weight of Colonel Pyotr Popov into the aircraft cabin. He was alive but barely. His face was ashen, his breathing shallow. Abrasions and bruises were already forming where the harness had bitten in. He had likely sustained minor compression fractures in his spine and ribs, the standard price of a Skyhook extraction. The crew medic immediately went to work, checking vitals, administering oxygen, and securing him for the turbulent flight out. They covered him with a survival blanket. He began to stir, coughing, disoriented, a man violently reborn into a different world. The C-119, now lighter and unencumbered, dropped back to the deck. The pilot pushed the engines to maximum continuous power. The navigator called out the twists and turns of the egress route, a mirror image of their ingress. The tension in the cockpit did not lessen, if anything, it increased. They now carried the mission's priceless prize, and his capture would be a geopolitical disaster. They listened for any sign of pursuit, the whine of a fighter's radar, the chatter of Soviet air defense radio traffic on their monitors. There was only silence. They crossed back out of Soviet airspace into Turkish territory as the first gray light of dawn tinged the eastern horizon. No interceptors scrambled. No SAMs were launched. No alarm was raised. At their base, the aircraft landed and was immediately towed into a hardened shelter. Popov, now coherent but in severe pain, was transferred to a waiting medical team and then to a secure debriefing site. Operation Viking Hammer was an unqualified, breathtaking success. It proved that the Fulton system could work not just in theory or with test dummies, but in a real-world high-stakes espionage scenario deep within the Soviet Union. It delivered a top-tier asset from the jaws of the GRU. And it did so without leaving a trace, without a firefight, without any acknowledgement from the Soviet Union that anything had occurred at all. The system had performed its first miracle, vanishing a man from under the nose of a superpower. The pilot's final report contained the ultimate vindication of the concept stealth. No reaction observed. The sky was empty. The success of Viking Hammer did not herald a new era of mass exfiltrations. Instead, it cemented the Skyhook as a weapon of absolute last resort, a magic bullet, to be used only for assets of the highest value in the most desperate circumstances. Its use remained exceedingly rare, each mission a standalone masterpiece of planning and risk. The system's next major chapter was maritime. In the early 1960s, with Soviet submarine and missile technology advancing rapidly, the U.S. needed to physically examine Soviet equipment. In 1962, the CIA launched Operation Cold Feet. A Soviet intelligence trawler had abandoned a top-secret acoustic intelligence buoy on an ice floe in the Arctic. A team was parachuted in, examined the device, and was to be extracted via Skyhook from the ice. The snatch of the equipment worked. The snatch of the two agents, however, was foiled by severe weather and a fouled line. In a testament to the mission's peril, the men were forced to destroy the sensitive gear and were eventually rescued by a more conventional and risky helicopter pickup. Cold Feet demonstrated the system's limits. It was brutally dependent on perfect conditions. But the true test of the Skyhook stealth came as Soviet air defenses evolved. The 1960s saw the proliferation of the SA-2 guideline surface-to-air missile system, the very weapon that had downed Gary Powers' U-2 in 1960. The SA-2's radar, the Fan Song, was more sophisticated and had better low-altitude capability than earlier systems. Furthermore, the Soviets began deploying look-down/shoot-down radar systems on interceptor aircraft like the MiG-25 Foxbat. In theory, these advancements should have closed the low-altitude loophole the Skyhook exploited. Yet, the system's fundamental advantage remained, its radical deviation from expected threat patterns. Soviet air defense was engineered to find and track aircraft intruding into their airspace. The Skyhook's profile was a brief, fleeting intrusion at an altitude often dismissed as ground clutter, followed by an almost immediate exit. It presented no bomb run, no reconnaissance loitering. It was a dart thrown into the periphery, gone before the guard could turn his head. There is no verified record of a Skyhook aircraft ever being engaged by Soviet air defenses. Their bafflement was not technological but doctrinal. They were not looking for and could not conceive of a mission profile that involved snatching a man from a field. The system found a new, grim utility in the proxy battlegrounds of the Cold War. While its use against the Soviet homeland may have been limited after the early 1960s, it was adapted for use in Southeast Asia during the Vietnam War. Here it was used not for spies, but for retrieving downed pilots, special operations teams and reconnaissance personnel from deep in the jungles of Laos and North Vietnam, where helicopter rescue was too risky or impossible. The jungle canopy, however, presented a new challenge. The balloon and line had to clear tall trees, requiring even more precise positioning. The CIA and the U.S. Air Force's Special Operations Wing continued to refine the technology. The C-119 was replaced by the more powerful and versatile Lockheed MC-130E Combat Talon I, specifically modified for clandestine operations. The yoke was refined, the winch systems improved, and training became more sophisticated. But with each technological improvement on the American side, the Soviet network also advanced. The constant cat-and-mouse game meant that every subsequent Skyhook plan had to be more perfect, more reliant on surprise than the last. It existed in a shrinking window of viability, a window that the dawn of a new intelligence age was about to close permanently. The decline of the Skyhook was not due to failure, but to obsolescence. By the late 1970s and into the 1980s, the intelligence landscape transformed. The advent of sophisticated satellite imagery, KH-11 keyhole, and advanced signals intelligence provided a flood of information without risking a human life. Why snatch a single agent when a satellite could photograph an entire military district every day? The risk-to-reward calculus shifted irrevocably. Furthermore, the very environment it exploited was disappearing. Soviet air defense technology, particularly the deployment of the MiG-31 interceptor with its powerful Zaslon phased-array radar and the long-range SA-10 Grumble missile system in the 1980s, began to systematically erase the low-altitude sanctuaries. These systems could look down, filter out ground clutter, and engage small, low-flying targets with terrifying efficiency. The window for a slow, low-flying MC-130 to penetrate, loiter, and execute a snatch had nearly slammed shut. The Skyhook's greatest trick, its improbability, was being rendered moot by pervasive, automated vigilance. The system was formally retired from the CIA's inventory in the late 1980s. But its DNA persisted within U.S. Special Operations Command. The concept of fixed-wing personnel recovery was too valuable to abandon entirely for certain high-risk, permissive environment missions. The MC-130 Combat Talon fleet retained a residual, scaled-down capability, sometimes referred to as the Fulton Stars, surface-to-air recovery system. It was used on rare occasions not behind the Iron Curtain, but in other denied areas. One of the last confirmed uses was in 2008, when a Joint Special Operations Command team utilized a similar method to retrieve a sensitive item, reportedly the body of a key insurgent leader, from a remote location. Its most curious legacy is in the realm of naval special operations. The U.S. Navy SEAL Delivery Vehicle, SDV, teams who deploy from submarines via mini-submarines, trained with a derivative system for decades. The method, known as the Submarine Parachute Assistance and Resupply Procedure, was essentially a submarine-launched Skyhook. A team or package could be floated to the surface, a balloon deployed and snatched by an MC-130, allowing for the rapid extraction of personnel from a covert submarine without it ever having to surface. This kept the mother submarine hidden and safe. The physical evidence of the Skyhook era is scarce. A few museum aircraft like the MC-130E at the Air Force Special Operations Command Museum in Florida sit with the distinctive nose yoke mounted, a silent artifact of a clandestine past. Declassified manuals and test footage survive in archives. But the true aftermath is written in the strategic lessons it embodied. It proved that asymmetry could defeat mass, that ingenuity could bypass fortification, if only for a brief, shining, and violently executed moment. For the Soviet and later Russian military analysts who pieced together the program's existence from fragments of intelligence and defector reports, the Skyhook represented a profound and unsettling vulnerability. It was not a weapon that could be countered by more missiles or faster jets. It was a weapon of imagination, a psychological operation as much as a physical one. It demonstrated that their vast steel curtain could be pierced not by a spear, but by a thread that, for a handful of men on a few desperate nights, became a lifeline to freedom, leaving behind only whispers and the enduring mystery of men who vanished into the sky. The Fulton Skyhook system exists at a unique crossroads in the history of conflict. It belongs not to the age of massed armies, nor fully to the age of digital abstraction, but to a brief, intensely human interlude in the Cold War. It was a machine built for the singular purpose of saving one person at a time, a quantitative absurdity in a war measured in megatonnage and missile counts. Its value was never in its scale, but in its profound symbolic weight. It represented the ultimate commitment to the individual asset. In an era where geopolitics was a game of immense, impersonal forces, the Skyhook was a testament to the belief that a single human being with the right information in their mind could alter the balance. It was a system that said, no one is beyond reach, no one is expendable. This ethos, the lengths to which a nation would go to recover its own, became a silent weapon of morale and recruitment, a legend in the shadow world of espionage. Technologically, it stands as a monument to analog ingenuity. In a pre-digital, pre-stealth world, it achieved a form of perfect operational stealth not through radar-absorbent materials, but through a brilliant exploitation of human and systemic psychology. It was a low-tech solution to a high-tech problem, using a balloon, a rope, and a precisely flown airplane to defeat a continent-spanning network of sensors and interceptors. Its genius was in its simplicity of concept and its terrifying complexity of execution. For the Soviet air defense troops who might have later learned of it, the Skyhook was the ultimate ghost story. It explained the inexplicable, a blip on a screen that vanished, a report of aircraft noise with no visual confirmation, the bizarre discovery of a strange harness or balloon fragment in a remote field. It was a flaw in their reality, a glitch in the system of total control that they were sworn to uphold. Their bafflement was the system's highest compliment. Today the Skyhook feels like a relic from a different planet. Its brazen physicality, its intimate, violent contact with the human body, and its sheer theatrical drama are alien in an age of drone strikes and cyber intrusions conducted from continents away. We have traded the visceral risk of the snatch for the sterile remove of the satellite feed and the keyboard command. But its legacy endures in the philosophy it embodied, the relentless pursuit of operational asymmetry, the willingness to engineer the impossible, and the enduring value placed on human intelligence, even as machines grow more powerful. The Skyhook was a machine, but its story is human, a story of fear, trust, engineering audacity, and the desperate, soaring hope of escape from the darkest of places. It reminds us that in the darkest hours of the silent war, the most powerful weapon was sometimes not a weapon at all, but a hook, a line, and a thread of courage stretching into the stars.